Chapter 9 of Palmetto Leaves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Penn. Palmetto Leaves by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 9. Florida for Invalids. We find an aggrieved feeling in the minds of the Floridian public in view of a letter in the Independent by Dr. Blank, headed as above, and we have been urgently requested to say something on the other view of the question. Little did we suppose that when we met our good friend at Magnolia, apparently in the height of spirits, the life of the establishment, and head promoter of all sorts of hilarity, that, under all this delightful cheerfulness, he was contending with such dreary experiences as his article in the Independent would lead one to suppose. Really, any one who should know the doctor only from that article might mistake him for a wretched hypochondriac, whereas we saw him, and heard of him by universal repute, at Magnolia, as one of the cheeriest and sunniest of the inmates, taking everything by the smoothest handle, and not only looking on the bright side himself, but making everybody else do the same. Imagine, therefore, our utter astonishment at finding our buoyant doctor summing up his Florida experience in such paragraphs as these. From what I have observed, I should think Florida was 9/10 water, and the other 10th swamp. Many are deceived by the milder climate here, and down they come to die. The mildness, too, is exaggerated. Yesterday morning the thermometer was at 36 degrees. Outside our winter overcoats were necessary, and great wood fires roared within. Now and then the thermometer reaches 80 degrees at midday, but that very night you may have frost. Another fact of Florida is malaria. How could it be otherwise? South Manhattan Island 2 feet deep in fresh water, and wouldn't the price of quinine rise? I have no objection to the term sunny South. It is a pretty alliteration, but I object to its application to Georgia and Florida in February. I wish you could have seen me last Friday night. We were riding 260 miles through a swamp, Okefenokee of the geographies. I was clad in full winter suit and heavy Russian overcoat. But a careful comparison of the incidents in his letter solves the mystery. The letter was written in an early date in the doctor's Floridian experience, and before he had had an opportunity of experiencing the benefit which he subsequently reaped from it. We perceive by the reference to last Friday night, and the ride through the Okefenokee swamp, that the doctor was then fresh from the north, and undergoing that process of disenchantment which many northern travelers experience, particularly those who come by railroad. The most ardent friends of Florida must admit that this railroad is by no means a prepossessing approach to the land of promise, and the midnight cold upon it is something likely to be had in remembrance. When we crossed it, however, we had a stove, which was a small imitation of Nebuchadnezzar's furnace, to keep us in heart. Otherwise there is a great deal of truth in our friend's allegations. As we have elsewhere remarked, every place, like a bit of tapestry, has its right side and its wrong side, and both are true and real. The wrong side, with its tags and rags and seams and knots and thrums of worsted, and the right side with its pretty picture. It is true, as the doctor says, that some invalids do come here, expose themselves imprudently, and die. People do die in Florida, if they use the means quite as successfully as in New York. It is true that sometimes the thermometer stands at 70 at noon, and that the nights are much cooler. It is true we have sometimes severe frosts in Florida. It is true we have malaria. It is true there are swamps in Florida, and it is quite apt to be true that if a man rides 100 miles through a swamp at night, he will feel pretty chilly. All these are undeniable truths. We never pretended that Florida was the kingdom of heaven, or the land where they shall no more say, "I am sick." It is quite the reverse. People, this very winter, have, in our neighborhood, had severe attacks of pneumonia, and undoubtedly many have come to Florida seeking health, and have not found it. Yet, on the other hand, there are now living in Florida many old established citizens and landowners who came here 10, 20, and 30 years ago, given over in consumption, who have here for years enjoyed a happy and vigorous life in spite of Okefenokee swamp and the malaria. Undoubtedly the country would be much better to live in if there were no swamps and no malaria, And so, also, New England would be better to live in if there were not 6 months of winter and 3 more months of cold weather there. As to malaria, it is not necessary to souse Manhattan Island under water to get that in and around New York. The new lands in New York will give you chills and fever quite as well as Florida. You can find malarial fevers almost anywhere in the towns between New York and New Haven, and it is notorious that many estates in the vicinity of New York and Philadelphia sell cheap on that very account, because they are almost as malarious as some Italian villas. Florida is not quite so bad as that yet, although it has its share of that malaria which attends the development of land in a new country. But the malarial fevers here are of a mild type, and easily managed, and they are generally confined to the fall months. The situation of Florida, surrounded by the sea and the free sweep of winds across it, temper the air and blow away malarial gases. In regard to consumptives and all other invalids, the influence of the Floridian climate depends very much on the nature of the case and the constitution of the individual. If persons suffer constitutionally from cold, if they are bright and well only in hot weather, if the winter chills and benumbs them till, in the spring, they are in the condition of a frost-bitten hothouse plant, alive to be sure, but with every leaf gone, then these persons may be quite sure that they will be better for a winter in Florida, and better still if they can take up their abode there. But if, on the contrary, persons are debilitated and wretched during the hot weather, and if cool weather braces them and gives them vigor and life, then such evidently have no call to Florida, and should be booked for Minnesota or some other dry, cold climate. There are consumptives belonging to both of these classes of constitution, and the coming of one of the wrong kind to Florida is of no use to himself, and is sure to bring discredit on the country. A little good common sense and reflection will settle the matter. Again, there is a form of what passes for consumption, which is, after all, some modification of liver complaint, and, so far as we have heard or observed, Florida is no place for these cases. The diseases here are of the bilious type, and those who have liver complaint are apt to grow worse rather than better. But there are classes of persons on whom the climate of Florida acts like a charm. There are certain nervously organized dyspeptics who require a great deal of open, outdoor life. They are in comfortable health during those months when they can spend half their time in the open air. They have no particular disease, but they have no great reserved strength, and cannot battle with severe weather. They cannot go out in snow or wind or on chilly, stormy days without risking more harm than they get good. Such, in our northern climate, are kept close prisoners for 6 months. From December to May they are shut into furnace-heated houses or air-tight stoves. The winter is one long struggle to keep themselves up. For want of the outdoor exercise which sustains them in summer, appetite and sleep both fail them. They have restless nights and bad digestion, and look anxiously to the end of winter as the only relief. For such, how slowly it drags! They watch the almanac. The sun crosses the line, the days grow a minute longer, spring will come by and by, but by what cruel irony was the month of March ever called spring? March, which piles snowstorms and windstorms on backs almost broken by endurance. The long agony of March and April is the breaking point with many a delicate person who has borne pretty well the regular winter. Said one who did much work, "I bear it pretty well through December. I don't so much mind January. February tires me a little, but I face it bravely. But by March I begin to say, 'Well, if this don't stop pretty soon, I shall. I can't get much further.'" But our heaviest snowstorms and most savage cold are often reserved for March, and to many an invalid it has given the final thrust. It is the last straw that breaks the camel's back. But after March, in New England, comes April, utterly untrustworthy, and with no assured outdoor life for a delicate person. As to the month of May, the poet Cowper has a lively poem ridiculing the poets who have made the charms of May the subject of their songs. Mother Nature is represented as thus addressing them. "Since you have thus combined," she said, "my favorite nymph to slight, adorning May, that peevish maid, with June's undoubted right, the minx, cursed for your folly's sake, shall prove herself a shrew, shall make your scribbling fingers ache, and bite your noses blue," which she generally does. So it is not really till June that delicately constituted persons, or persons of impaired vigor, really feel themselves out of prison. They have then about 5 months at most in which they can live an open-air life before the prison doors close on them again. Now, the persons who would be most benefited by coming to Florida are not the desperately diseased, the confirmed consumptives, but those of such impaired physical vigor that they are in danger of becoming so. An ounce of prevention here is worth many pounds of cure. It is too often the case that the care and expense that might have prevented disease from settling are spent in vain after it has once fastened. Sad it is indeed to see the wan and wasted faces, and hear the hollow death cough of those who have been brought here too late. Yet, in hundreds of instances, yes, in thousands, where one more severe northern winter would have fastened disease on the vitals, a winter in a southern climate has broken the spell. The climate of Florida is also of peculiar advantage in all diseases attended by nervous excitability. The air is peculiarly soothing and tranquilizing. It is the veritable lotus eater's paradise, full of quiet and repose. We have known cases where the sleeplessness of years has given way, under this balmy influence, to the most childlike habit of slumber. For debility, and the complaints that spring from debility, Florida is not so good a refuge, perhaps, as some more northern point, like Aiken. The air here is soothing, but not particularly bracing. It builds up and strengthens, not by any tonic effect in itself, so much as by the opportunity for constant open-air life and exercise which it affords. For children the climate cannot be too much praised. In our little neighborhood are 7 about as lively youngsters as could often be met with, and the winter has been one long outdoor play spell. There has not been a cough, nor a cold, nor an ailment of any kind, and scarce an anxiety. All day long we hear their running and racing, down to the boat wharves, in the boats, which they manage as dexterously as little Sandwich Islanders, fishing, catching crabs, or off after flowers in the woods, with no trouble of hail, sleet, or wet feet. Truly it is a child's Eden, and they grow and thrive accordingly. Now, as to malaria, that is a word requiring consideration to those who expect to make Florida a permanent home, but having no terrors for those who come to spend winters merely. There is no malaria in winter, and Dr. C may be consoled in reflecting that frost always destroys it, so that when the thermometer is, as he says, at 32 degrees, there is no danger, even though one be in the same state with 40 swamps. In fact, for ourselves, we prefer a cool winter such as this has been. An October-like winter, when it is warm in the middle of the day, and one can enjoy a bright fire on the hearth morning and night, is the most favorable to outdoor exercise and to health. But merely to come to Florida, and idle away time at the St. James or the St. Augustine Hotel, taking no regular exercise, and having no employment for mind or body, is no way to improve by being here. It is because the climate gives opportunity of open-air exercise that it is so favorable. But if one neglects all these opportunities, he may gain very little. It cannot be too often impressed on strangers coming here that what cold there is will be more keenly felt than in a northern climate. Persons should vary their clothing carefully to the varying temperature, and be quite as careful to go warmly clad as in the colder states. In our furnace-heated houses at the north, we generally wear thick woolen dresses and under flannels, and keep up a temperature of from 70 to 80 degrees. In the south we move to a much lower temperature, and have only the open fire upon the hearth. It is therefore important to go warmly clad, and particularly to keep on flannels until the warm weather of April becomes a settled thing. In regard to the healthfulness of Florida, some things are to be borne in mind. In a state that has the reputation for being an invalid's asylum, many desperate cases necessarily take refuge, and, of course, many die. Yet, notwithstanding the loss from these causes, the census of 1860 showed that the number of deaths from pulmonary complaints is less to the population than in any state of the Union. In Massachusetts the rate is 1 in 254. In California 1 in 727. In Florida 1 in 1447. Surgeon General Lawson of the United States Army, in his report, asserts that the ratio of deaths to the number of cases of remittent fever has been much less among the troops serving in Florida than in any other portions of the United States. In the Middle Division, the proportion is 1 death to 36 cases of fever. In the Northern, 1 to 52. In Texas, 1 to 78. In California, 1 in 122. While in Florida, it is 1 in 287. Such statistics as these are more reliable than the limited observations of any one individual. In regard to sudden changes of climate, Florida is certainly not in all parts ideally perfect. There are, at times, great and sudden changes there, but not by any means as much as in most other states of the Union. Sudden changes from heat to cold are the besetting sin of this fallen world. It is the staple subject of grumbling among the invalids who visit Italy, and, in fact, it is probably one of the consequences of Adam's fall, which we are not to be rid of till we get to the land of pure delight. It may, however, comfort the hearts of visitors to Florida to know that, if the climate here is not, in this respect, just what they would have it, it is about the best there is going. All this will be made quite clear to any one who studies the tables of observations on temperature contained in The Guide to Florida, where they can see an accurate account of the range of thermometers for 5 successive years as compared with that in other states. One thing cannot be too often reiterated to people who come to Florida, and that is, that they must not expect at once to leave behind them all sickness, sorrow, pain, inconvenience of any kind, and to enter at once on the rest of paradise. The happiness, after all, will have to be comparative, and the inconveniences are to be borne by reflecting how much greater inconveniences are avoided. For instance, when we have a 3 days' damp, drizzling rainstorm down here, we must reflect that, at the North, it is a driving snowstorm. When it is brisk cold weather here, it is an intolerable freeze there. The shadow and reflection of all important changes at the North travel down to us in time. The exceptionally cold weather at the North has put our season back a month behind its usual springtime. The storms travel downward, coming to us generally a little later and in a modified form. We cannot better illustrate this than by 2 experiences this year. Easter morning we were waked by birds singing, and it was the most heavenly morning. We walked out in the calm, dewy freshness to gather flowers to dress our house, the only church we have now in which to hold services. In the low swamp land near our home is a perfect field of blue iris, whose bending leaves were all beaded with dew, and we walked in among them, admiring the wonderful vividness of their coloring, and gathering the choicest to fill our large vase. Then we cut verbenas, white, scarlet, and crimson, rose geraniums and myrtle, callas and roses, while already on our tables were vases of yellow jessamine gathered the night before. The blue St. John's lay in misty bands of light and shade in the distance, and the mockingbirds and redbirds were singing a loud Te Deum. Now for the North. Our friend in Hartford writes, "I was awaked by the patter of snow and sleet on the window pane. Not a creature could go out to church. The storm was so severe even the Irish were obliged to keep housed. With all we could do with a furnace and morning glory stove, we could not get the temperature of our house above 55 degrees. In the latter part of the day, we at Mandarin had some rough, chilling winds, which were the remains of the northern Easter storm, but we were wise enough to rejoice in the good we had, instead of fretting at the shadow of evil." End of chapter 9.
Chapter 10 of Palmetto Leaves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. Palmetto Leaves by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 10. Swamps and Orange Trees. March 25th, 1872. After a cold, damp, rainy week, we have suddenly had dropped upon us a balmy, warm summer day, thermometer at 80, and everything out of doors growing so fast that you may see and hear it grow. The swampy belt of land in front of the house is now bursting forth in clouds of blue iris of every shade, from the palest and faintest to the most vivid lapis lazuli tint. The wild rose bushes there are covered with buds, and the cypress trees are lovely with their vivid little feathers of verdure. This swamp is one of those crooks in our lot which occasions a never-ceasing conflict of spirit. It is a glorious, bewildering impropriety. The trees and shrubs in it grow as if they were possessed, and there is scarcely a month in the year that it does not flame forth in some new blossom. It is a perpetual flower garden, where creepers run and tangle, where nature has raptures and frenzies of growth and conducts herself like a crazy, drunken, but beautiful bacchante. But what to do with it is not clear. The river rises and falls in it, and under all that tangle of foliage lies a foul sink of the blackest mud. The black, unsavory moccasin snakes are said and believed to have their lair in those jungles, where foot of man cares not to tread. Gigantic bulrushes grow up, clumps of high-water grasses, willows, elms, maples, cypresses, Magnolia glauca, sweet bay, make brave show of foliage. Below, the blue pickerel weed, the St. John's lily, the blue iris, wild roses, blossoming tufts of elder, together with strange flowers of names unspoken, make a goodly fellowship. The birds herd there in droves. Redbirds glance like gems through the boughs. Catbirds and sparrows and jays babble and jargon there in the green labyrinths made by the tangling vines. We muse over it, meanwhile enjoying the visible coming on of spring in its foliage. The maples have great red leaves, curling with their own rapid growth. The elms feather out into graceful plumes, and the cypress, as we said before, most brilliant of all spring greens, puts forth its fairy foliage. Verily, it is the most gorgeous of improprieties, this swamp, and we will let it alone this year also, and see what will come of it. There are suggestions of ditching and draining, and what not, that shall convert the wild bacchante into a steady, orderly member of society. We shall see. Spring is a glory anywhere, but as you approach the tropics there is a vivid brilliancy, a burning tone to the coloring that is peculiar. We are struck with the beauty of the catbriers. We believe they belong to the smilax family, and the kinds that prevail here are evergreen, and have quaintly marked leaves. Within a day or two these glossy black-green vines have thrown out trembling red sprays shining with newness, with long tendrils waving in the air. The vigor of a red young shoot that seems to spring out in an hour has something delightful in it. Yellow jessamine, alas, is fading. The ground is strewn with pale yellow trumpets, as if the elves had had a concert and thrown down their instruments and fled. Now the vines throw out young shoots half a yard long and infinite in number, and jessamine goes on to possess and clothe new regions, which next February shall be yellow with flowers. Farewell for this year, sweet Medea of the woods, with thy golden fleece of blossoms. Why couldst thou not stay with us through the year? Emerson says quaintly, 70 salads measure the life of a man. The things, whether of flower or fruit, that we can have but once a year, mark off our lives. A lover might thus tell the age of his lady love. 17 times had the jessamine blossomed since she came into the world. The time of the bloom of the jessamine is about 2 months. In the middle of January, when we came down, it was barely budded, the 25th of March, and it is past. But, not to give all our time to flowers, we must now fulfill our promise to answer letters, and give practical information. A gentleman propounds to us the following inquiry. Apart from the danger from frosts, what is the prospect of certainty in the orange crop? Is it a steady one? We have made diligent inquiry from old, experienced cultivators, and from those who have collected the traditions of orange growing, and the result seems to be that apart from the danger of frost, the orange crop is the most steady and certain of any known fruit. In regard to our own grove, consisting of 115 trees on an acre and a half of ground, we find that there has been an average crop matured of 60,000 a year for each of the 5 years we have had it. 2 years the crop was lost through sudden frost, coming after it was fully perfected, but these 2 years are the only ones since 1835 when a crop has been lost or damaged through frost. Our friend inquires with regard to the orange insect. This was an epidemic which prevailed some 15 or 20 years ago, destroying the orange trees as the cankerworms did the apple trees. It was a variety of the scale bug but nothing has been seen of it in an epidemic form for many years, and growers now have no apprehensions from this source. The wonderful vital and productive power of the orange tree would not be marveled at could one examine its roots. The ground all through our grove is a dense mat or sponge of fine yellow roots, which appear like a network on the least displacing of the sand. Every ramification has its feeder, and sucks up food for the tree with avidity. The consequence is that people who have an orange grove must be contented with that, and not try to raise flowers. But nevertheless we do try, because we can't help it. But every fertilizer that we put upon our roses and flower beds is immediately rushed after by these hungry yellow orange roots. At the root of our great live oak we wanted a little pet colony of flowers, and had muck and manure placed there to prepare for them. In digging there lately, we found every particle of muck and manure netted round with the fine embracing fibers from the orange tree 10 feet off. The consequence is that our roses grow slowly, and our flower garden is not a success. Oleanders, Cape jessamines, pomegranates, and crepe myrtles manage, however, to stand their ground. Any strong, woody fibered plant does better than most delicate flowers, as people who will insist upon their rights and fight for them do best in the great scramble of life. But what a bouquet of sweets is an orange tree! Merely as a flowering tree it is worth having, if for nothing else. We call the time of their budding the week of pearls. How beautiful, how almost miraculous, the leaping forth of these pearls to gem the green leaves! The fragrance has a stimulating effect on our nerves, a sort of dreamy intoxication. The air now is full of it. Under the trees the white shell petals drift, bearing perfume. But not to lose our way in poetic raptures, we return to statistics drawn from a recent conversation with our practical neighbor. He has 3 trees in his grounds, which this year have each borne 5,000 oranges. He says that he has never failed of a steady crop from any cause, except in the first of the 2 years named, and in that case it is to be remembered the fruit was perfected and only lost by not being gathered. He stated that he had had reports from 2 men whom he named who had each gathered 10,000 from a single tree. He appeared to think it a credible story, though a very remarkable yield. The orange can be got from seed. Our neighbors' trees, the largest and finest in Mandarin, are seedlings. Like ours, they were frozen down in 1835, and subsequently almost destroyed by the orange insect. But now they are stately, majestic trees of wonderful beauty. The orange follows the quality of the seed and needs no budding, and in our region this mode of getting the trees is universally preferred. Fruit may be expected from the seed in 6 years when high cultivation is practiced. A cultivator in our neighborhood saw a dozen trees with an average of 300 oranges on each, at 7 years from the seed. Young seedling plants of 3 years' growth can be bought in the nurseries on the St. Johns River. Our young folks have been thrown into a state of great excitement this afternoon by the introduction among them of 2 live alligators. Our friend Mr. P. went for them to the lair of the old alligator, which he describes as a hole in the bank where the eggs are laid. Hundreds of little alligators were crawling in and out, the parents letting them shift for themselves. They feed upon small fish. Our young protégé snapped in a very suggestive manner at a stick offered to him, and gave an energetic squeak. We pointed out to the children that if it were their finger or toe that was in the stick's place, the consequences might be serious. After all, we have small sympathy with capturing these poor monsters. We shall have some nice tales to tell of them anon. Meanwhile, our paper must end here. End of chapter 10.
Chapter 11 of Palmetto Leaves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. Palmetto Leaves by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 11. Letter Writing. April 14th. Our Palmetto correspondence increases daily. Our mail comes only twice a week, and as the result of the last 2 mails, we find 15 letters propounding various inquiries about Florida. Now, it would be a most delightful thing to be on sociable terms with all the world, and we would be glad to reply to each one of these letters. Many of them are sprightly and amusing. All are written in good faith, containing most natural and rational inquiries. But let any one attempt the task of writing 15 letters on one subject, and he will soon find that it is rather more than can be done by one who expects to do anything else. Some of the inquiries, however, we may as well dispose of in the beginning of this letter. The first as to the little boy who has lost his cat, and wishes to know if we cannot spare Peter to take her place. Alas! we have a tale of sadness to unfold. When we began our Palmetto Leaves, we were embarrassed possessors of 4 thrifty cats. Now every one of them has passed to the land of shades, and we are absolutely catless. Peter, we regret to say, was killed in consequence of being mistaken for a rabbit one moonlit night by an enterprising young sportsman. Annie was unfortunately drowned, and Cindy fell victim to some similar hallucination of the young son of a gun who destroyed Peter. In short, only our old family mother cat remained. But as she had a fine litter of kittens, there was hope that the line would be continued. We established her sumptuously in a box in the back shed with her nurslings. But as cruel fate would have it, a marauding dog came smelling about, and a fight ensued, in which Puss's foreleg was broken, or, to speak quite literally, chewed up. Wounded and bleeding, but plucky to the last, she drove off the dog with a predestined scratched face, and taking up her kittens one by one in her mouth, traversed a long veranda, jumped through a window into the bedroom of one of her mistresses, and deposited her nurslings under the bed. All agreed that a cat of such spirit and gallantry had shown that she ought to vote by her ability to fight, and that she was at least worthy of distinguished attention. So the next day the whole family sat in council on the case. Chloroform was administered, and while Puss was insensible, a promising young naturalist set and bandaged the limb. But, alas, without avail. The weather was hot, and the sufferings of the poor creature soon became such that we were thankful that we had the power, by a swift and painless death, to put an end to them. So a pistol ball sent Puss to the land where the good cats go, and the motherless kitties found peace under the blue waters of the St. John's. The water nymphs undoubtedly held up their pearled wrists and took them in, and doubtless made blessed pets of them. So that is the end of all our cats. Phoebus rejoices now, for there is none to molest or make him afraid. His songs increase daily in variety. He pipes and whistles, occasionally breaks forth into a litany that sounds like "Pray do, pray do, pray do." Then suddenly changes the stop. He shouts, "De devil, de devil, de devil!" But as he is otherwise a bird of most correct habits, I cannot be supposed that any profanity is intended. This morning being Sunday, he called "Beecher, Beecher, Beecher" very volubly. He evidently is a progressive bird, and for aught we know, may yet express himself on some of the questions of the day. The next letter in our file wants to know the prices of board at Green Cove Springs, Magnolia, and Hibernia. The prices at these places vary all the way from $12 to $35 per week, according to accommodation. The higher prices are in larger hotels, and the smaller in private boarding houses. The Florida Guide says board can be obtained in Jacksonville in private families at from $8 to $10 per week. There are 3 more letters asking questions about the culture of the orange, to which the writers will find answers, so far as we can give them, when we come to speak of the orange orchards up the river. A lady writes to ask if we know any way of preserving figs. Practically, we know nothing about the fig harvest, having never been there when they were ripe. Our friends tell us that they are not successful in preserving them in cans. They make a delicious, though rather luscious, preserve done in the ordinary way, like peaches. But we will give our inquiring friend the benefit of a piece of information communicated to us by an old native Floridian, who professed to have raised and prepared figs as fine as those in Turkey. His receipt was as follows: Prepare a lye from the ashes of the grapevine. Have a kettle of this kept boiling hot over the fire. Throw in the figs and let them remain 2 minutes. Skim them out and drain them on a sieve, and afterwards dry in the sun. Such was his receipt, which we have never tried. Probably any other strong lye would answer as well as that from the grapevine. As to those who have asked for flowers from Florida, we wish it were in our power to grant their requests. But these frail beauties are not transferable. We in our colony have taxed the resources of our postal arrangements to carry to our friends small specimens, but with no very encouraging results. We have been making the grand round or tour up the St. John's to Enterprise, across to St. Augustine, and back, which is necessary to constitute one an accomplished Floridian sightseer, and it had been our intention to devote this letter to that trip. But there is so much to say, there are so many wonders and marvels to be described, that we must give it a letter by itself. No dreamland on earth can be more unearthly in its beauty and glory than the St. John's in April. Tourists, for the most part, see it only in winter, when half its gorgeous forests stand bare of leaves, and go home never dreaming what it would be like in its resurrection robes. So do we, in our darkness, judge the shores of the river of this mortal life, up which we sail ofttimes disappointed and complaining. We are seeing all things in winter, and not as they will be, when God shall wipe away all tears, and bring about the new heavens and new earth, of which every spring is a symbol and a prophecy. The flowers and leaves of last year vanish for a season, but they come back fresher and fairer than ever. This bright morning we looked from the roof of our veranda, and our neighbor's oleander trees were glowing like a great crimson cloud, and we said, "There, the oleanders have come back." No northern ideas can give the glory of these trees as they raise their heads in their native land, and seem to be covered with great crimson roses. The poor stunted bushes of northern greenhouses are as much like it as our stunted virtues and poor frost-nipped enjoyments shall be like the bloom and radiance of God's paradise hereafter. In April they begin to bloom, and they bloom on till November. Language cannot do justice to the radiance, the brightness, the celestial calm and glory of these spring days. There is an assurance of perpetuity in them. You do not say, as at the North, that a fine day is a weather breeder, and expect a week of storms to pay for it. Day after day passes in brightness. Morning after morning you wake to see the same sunshine gilding the tops of the orange trees, and hear the same concert of birds. All the forest trees stand in perfected glory, and the leaves have sprung forth with such rapidity and elastic vigor as gives the foliage a wondrous brightness. The blackjack oaks, trees which for some reason or other are apt to be spoken of as of small account, have now put forth their large, sharply cut oak-shaped leaves. We say this because it is the only one of the oak species here that at all resembles the oaks we have been accustomed to see. The pawpaw bushes are all burst out in white fringes of blossom, and the silver bells of the sparkleberry are now in their perfection. Underfoot, a whole tribe of new flowers have come in place of the departed violets. The partridge-berry, or squawberry of the North, grows in the woods in dense mats, and is now white with its little starry blossoms. Certain nameless little golden balls of flowers, twinkle in the grass and leaves like small constellations. We call them, for lack of botanic language, sun kisses. Our party the other night made an expedition to the second branch, and brought home long vines of purple wisteria, red trumpet creeper, and some sprays of white blossoms unknown to us, so that our house still is a flower show. Spring is as much a pomp and glory here as it is in northern states; for although the winter is far more endurable, and preserves far more beauty, yet the outburst of vividness and vigor when the sun begins to wax powerful is even greater and more marked than at the north. The roses are now in perfection. Ours have not thriven as they might have done were it not for the all-devouring orange trees; but still they give us every morning with our breakfast a comforting assortment. Lamarck, giant of the battles, Hermosa, a little cluster rose, and a dozen more have brightened our repast. This is the land to raise roses, however, and we mean yet to have a rose garden at a safe distance from any orange trees, and see what will come of it. Here are no slugs, or rosebugs, or caterpillars to make rose culture a burden and a vexation. Finally, as we have had so many letters asking information of us, we wish somebody who is wise enough would write one, and give us some on a certain point. One of our orange trees has become an invalid. The case may be stated as follows. Early in the season, Mr. F., in looking over the grove, found this tree, then loaded with fruit, dropping its leaves. The leaves curling, or as they say here, rolling, as is the fashion of orange trees when suffering from drought. Immediately he took all the fruit from the tree, pruned it, dug about the roots, and examined them to find something to account for this. For a while, by careful tending, the tree seemed to be coming to itself. But when the blossoming time came round, half its leaves fell, and it burst into blossoms on every spray and twig in the most preternatural manner. It reminded us of some poor dear women, who, when they lose their health, seem resolved to kill themselves in abundant good works. It was really blossoming to death. Now we ask any wise fruit growers, what is this disease, and how is it to be treated? We have treated it by cutting off all the blossoms, cutting back the branches, watering with water in which guano and lime have been dissolved, and the patient looks a little better. A negro workman testified that a tree in a similar state had been brought back by these means. Can any fruit grower give any light on this subject? End of chapter 11.
Chapter 12 of Palmetto Leaves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. Palmetto Leaves by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 12. Magnolia Week. April 20th. It is vain to propose and announce subjects from week to week. One must write what one is thinking of. When the mind is full of one thing, why go about to write on another? The past week we have been engrossed by magnolias. On Monday, our friend D., armed and equipped with scaling ladders, ascended the glistening battlements of the great forest palaces fronting his cottage, and bore thence the white princesses, just bursting into bud, and brought them down to us. Forthwith all else was given up, for who would take the portrait of the white lady must hurry, for like many queens of earth, there is but a step between perfected beauty and decay, a moment between beauty and ashes. We bore them to our chamber, and before morning the whole room was filled with the intoxicating, dreamy fragrance, and lo, while we slept, the pearly hinges had revolved noiselessly, and the bud that we left the evening before had become a great and glorious flower. To descend to particulars, imagine a thick, waxen-cupped peony of the largest size, just revealing in its center an orange-colored cone of the size of a walnut. Around it, like a circlet of emeralds, were the new green leaves, contrasting in their vivid freshness with the solid, dark green brilliancy of the old foliage. The leaves of the magnolia are in themselves beauty enough without the flower. We used to gather them in a sort of rapture before we ever saw the blossom, but all we can say of the flower is that it is worthy of them. We sat down before this queen of flowers and worked assiduously at her portrait. We had, besides the full blossom, one bud of the size and shape of a large egg, which we despaired of seeing opened, but proposed to paint as it was. The second morning our green egg began to turn forth a silver lining, and as we worked we could see it slowly opening before us. Silvery and pearly were the pure tips, while the outside was of a creamy yellow melting into green. 2 days we kept faithful watch and ward at the shrine, but lo, on the morning of the third our beautiful fairy had changed in the night to an ugly brownie. The petals, so waxen fair the night before, had become of a mahogany color, and a breeze passing by swept them dishonored in showers on the floor. The history of that magnolia was finished. We had seen it unfold and die. Our pearly bud, however, went on waxing and opening till its day came for full perfection. The third day our friend again brought in a glorious bouquet. No ordinary flower vase would hold it. It required a heavy stone jar and a gallon of water. But we filled the recess of our old-fashioned Franklin stove with the beauties, and the whole house was scented with their perfume. Then we thought of the great lonely swamps and Everglades, where thousands of these beauties are now bursting into flower with no earthly eye to behold them. The old German legends of female spirits inhabiting trees recurred to us. Our magnolia would make a beautiful Libussa. A flower is commonly thought the emblem of a woman, and a woman is generally thought of as something sweet, clinging, tender, and perishable. But there are women flowers that correspond to the forest magnolia, high and strong, with a great hold of root and a great spread of branches, and whose pulsations of heart and emotion come forth like these silver lilies that illuminate the green shadows of the magnolia forests. Yesterday, our friend the Reverend Mr. M. called and invited us to go with him to visit his place, situated at the mouth of Julington, just where it flows into the St. John's. Our obliging neighbor immediately proposed to take the whole party in his sailing yacht. An impromptu picnic was proclaimed through the house. Everyone dropped the work in hand and flew to spreading sandwiches. Oranges were gathered, luncheon baskets packed, and the train filed out from the 2 houses. The breeze was fresh and fair, and away we flew. Here on the St. John's a water coach is more to the purpose, in the present state of our wood roads, than any land carriage, and the delight of sailing is something infinitely above any other locomotion. On this great beautiful river you go drifting like a feather or a cloud, while the green fragrant shores form a constantly varying picture as you pass. Yesterday, as we were sailing, we met a little green floating island, which seemed to have started out on its own account, and gone to seek its fortune. We saw it at first in the distance, a small, undulating spot of vivid green. Our little craft was steered right alongside, so that we could minutely observe. It was some half-dozen square yards of pickerel weed, bonnet, water lettuce, and other water plants, which, it would seem, had concluded to colonize, and go out to see the world in company. We watched them as they went nodding and tilting off over the blue waters, and wondered where they would bring up. But now we are at the mouth of Julington, and running across to a point of land on the other side. Our boat comes to anchor under a grove of magnolia trees which lean over the water. They are not yet fully in blossom. One lily-white bud and one full-blown flower appear on a low branch overhanging the river, and are marked to be gathered when we return. We go up and begin strolling along the shore. The magnolia grove extends along the edge of the water for half a mile. Very few flowers are yet developed, but the trees themselves, in the vivid contrast of the new leaves with the old, are beauty enough. Out of the center of the spike of last year's solemn green comes the most vivid, varnished cluster of fresh young leaves, and from the center of this brilliant cluster comes the flower bud. The magnolia, being an evergreen, obeys in its mode of growth the law which governs all evergreens. When the new shoots come out, the back leaves fall off. This produces in the magnolia a wonderfully beautiful effect of color. As we looked up in the grove, each spike had, first, the young green leaves, below those the dark heavy ones, and below those still the decaying ones, preparing to fall. These change with all the rich colors of decaying leaves. Some are of a pure, brilliant yellow, others yellow, mottled and spotted with green, others take a tawny orange, and again a faded brown. The afternoon sun, shining through this grove, gave all these effects of color in full brightness. The trees as yet had but here and there a blossom. Each shoot had its bud, for the most part no larger than a walnut. The most advanced were of the size of an egg, of white tinted with green. Beneath the trees the ground was thickly strewn with the golden brown and mottled leaves, which were ever and anon sailing down as the wind swayed them. Numbers of little seedling magnolias were springing up everywhere about us, and we easily pulled up from the loose yielding soil quite a number of them, wrapping their roots in the gray moss which always lies at hand for packing purposes. The place had many native wild orange trees, which had been cut off and budded with the sweet orange, and were making vigorous growth. Under the shade of the high live oaks, Mr. M. had set out young orange and lemon trees through quite an extent of the forest. He told us that he had 2,000 plants thus growing. It is becoming a favorite idea with fruit planters here that the tropical fruits are less likely to be injured by frosts, and make a more rapid and sure growth, under the protecting shadow of live oaks. The wild orange is found frequently growing in this way, and they take counsel of nature in this respect. After wandering a while in the wood, we picnicked under a spreading live oak, with the breeze from the river drawing gratefully across us. Our dinner over, Mr. M. took us through his plantations of grapes, peaches, and all other good things. Black Hamburg grapes grafted upon the root of the native vine had made luxuriant growth, and were setting full of grapes. There were shoots of this year's growth full 6 and 7 feet in length. In the peach orchard were trees covered with young peaches, which Mr. M. told us were only 3 years from the seed. All the garden vegetables were there in fine order, and the string beans appeared to be in full maturity. It is now 5 years since Mr. M. bought and began to clear this place, then a dense forest. At first the letting in of the sun on the decaying vegetation and the upturning of the soil made the place unhealthy, and it was found necessary to remove the family. Now the work is done, the place cleared, and he says as healthy as any other. Mr. M. is an enthusiastic horticulturist and florist, and is about to enrich the place with a rose garden of some thousands of choice varieties. These places in Florida must not in any wise be compared with the finished ones of northern states. They are spots torn out of the very heart of the forest, and where nature is rebelling daily, and rushing with all her might back again into the wild freedom from which she has been a moment led captive. But a day is coming when they will be wonderfully beautiful and productive. We had one adventure in conquering and killing a formidable looking black snake, about 7 feet in length. He had no fangs, and Mr. M. told us belonged to a perfectly respectable and harmless family, whose only vice is chicken stealing. They are called chicken snakes, in consequence of the partiality they show for young chickens, which they swallow feathers and all, with good digestion and relish. He informed us that they were vigorous ratters, and better than any terrier or cat for keeping barns clear of rats, and that for this purpose they were often cherished in granaries, as they will follow the rats to retreats where cats cannot go. Imagine the feelings of a rat when this dreadful visitor comes like grim death into his family circle. In regard to snakes in general, the chance of meeting hurtful ones in Florida is much less than in many other states. Mr. M., who, in the way of his mission, has ridden all through Florida, never yet met a rattlesnake, or was endangered by any venomous serpent. Perhaps the yearly burnings of the grass, which have been practiced so long in Florida, have had some effect in checking the increase of serpents by destroying their eggs. As the afternoon sun waxed low, we sought our yacht again, and came back with 2 magnolia flowers and several buds. This week, too, the woods are full of the blossoms of the passion flower. Our neighbor, Mr. C., has bought the beautiful oak hammock where he is preparing to build a house. Walking over to see the spot the other evening, we found a jungle of passion flowers netted around on the ground and clinging to bush and tree. Another neighbor also brought us in some branches of a flowering shrub called the Indian pipe, which eclipses the sparkleberry. Like that, it seems to be a glorified variety of high huckleberry or blueberry. It has the greatest profusion of waxen white bells fringing every twig, and blasé as we have been with floral displays, we had a new sensation when it was brought into the house. Thus goes the floral procession in April in the wild woods. In the gardens, the oleanders, pink, white, and deep crimson, are beginning their long season of bloom. The scarlet pomegranate, with its vivid sparks of color, shines through the leaves. We are sorry for all those who write to beg that we will send by mail a specimen of this or that flower. Our experience has shown us that in that way they are not transferable. Magnolia buds would arrive dark and dreadful, and it is far better to view the flowers ever fresh and blooming through imagination than to receive a desolate, faded, crumpled remnant by mail. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Palmetto Leaves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. Palmetto Leaves by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Buying Land in Florida, May 2nd. We have before us a neat little pile of what we call Palmetto letters, responses to our papers from all states in the Union. Our knowledge of geography has really been quite brightened by the effort to find out where all our correspondents are living. Nothing could more mark the exceptional severity of the recent winter than the bursts of enthusiasm with which the tidings of flowers and open-air freedom in Florida have come to those struggling through snowdrifts and hailstorms in the more ungenial parts of our Union. Florida seems to have risen before their vision as the hymn sings of better shores. On Jordan's stormy banks I stand and cast a wistful eye to Canaan's fair and happy land. Consequently, the letters of inquiry have come in showers. What is the price of land? Where shall we go? How shall we get there? Etc. We have before advertised you, O beloved unknown, who write that your letters are welcome, ofttimes cheering, amusing, and undeniably nice letters. Yet we cannot pledge ourselves to answer, except in the gross and through the Christian Union. The last inquiry is from 3 brothers who want to settle and have homes together at the South. They ask, is there government land that can be had in Florida? Yes, there is plenty of it. Yet, as Florida is the oldest settled state in the Union, and has always been a sort of bone for which adventurers have wrangled, the best land in it has been probably taken up. We do not profess to be land agents, and we speak only for the tract of land lying on the St. Johns River, between Mandarin and Jacksonville, when we say that there are thousands of acres of good land, near to a market, near to a great river on which 3 or 4 steamboats are daily plying, that can be had for $5 per acre, and for even less than that. Fine, handsome building lots in the neighborhood of Jacksonville are rising in value, commanding much higher prices than the mere productive value of the land. In other words, men pay for advantages, for society, for facilities afforded by settlements. Now, For the benefit of those who are seriously thinking of coming to Florida, we have taken some pains to get the practical experience of men who are now working the land as to what it will do. On the 2nd of May we accepted the invitation of Colonel Hardy to visit his pioneer nursery, now in the 4th year of its existence. Mr. Hardy is an enthusiast in his business, and it is a department where we are delighted to see enthusiasm. The close of the war found him, as he said, miserably poor. But, brave and undiscouraged, he retained his former slaves as free laborers, took a tract of land about 1.5 miles from Jacksonville, put up a house, cleared, planted, plowed, and digged, and in the course of 4 years results are beginning to tell handsomely, as they always do for energy and industry. He showed us through his grounds, where everything was growing at the rate things do grow here in the month of May. 2 things Mr. Hardy seems to have demonstrated. First, that strawberry culture may be a success in Florida, and second, that certain varieties of northern apples and pears may be raised here. We arrived in Florida in the middle of January, and one of the party who spent a night at the St. James was surprised by seeing a peck of fresh, ripe strawberries brought in. They were from Mr. Hardy's nursery, and grown in the open air, and he informed us that they had, during all the winter, a daily supply of the fruit, sufficient for a large family, and a considerable overplus for the market. The month of May, however, is the height of the season, and they were picking, they informed us, at the rate of 80 quarts per day. In regard to apples and pears, Mr. Hardy's method is to graft them upon the native hawthorn, and the results are really quite wonderful. Mr. Hardy was so complaisant as to cut and present to us a handsome cluster of red astrakhan apples about the size of large hickory nuts, the result of the 2nd year from the graft. Several varieties of pears had made a truly astonishing growth, and promised to fruit, in time, abundantly. A large peach orchard presented a show of peaches, some of the size of a butternut and some of a walnut. Concerning one which he called the Japan peach, he had sanguine hope of ripe fruit in 10 days. We were not absolute in the faith as to the exact date, but believe that there will undoubtedly be ripe peaches there before the month of May is out. Mr. Hardy is particularly in favor of cultivating fruit in partially shaded ground. Most of these growths we speak of were under the shade of large live oaks, but when he took us into the wild forest and showed us peach, orange, and lemon trees set to struggle for existence on the same footing, and with only the same advantages as the wild denizens of the forest, we rather demurred. Was not this pushing theory to extremes? Time will show. Colonel Hardy has 2 or 3 native seedling peaches grown in Florida, of which he speaks highly. Mrs. Thompson's Golden Free, which commences ripening in June, and continues till the 1st of August, the Cracker Cart, very large, weighing sometimes 13 ounces, the Cling Yellow, and the Japan, very small and sweet, ripening in May. Besides these, Mr. Hardy has experimented largely in vines, in which he gives preference to the Isabella, Hartford Prolific, and Concord. He is also giving attention to roses and ornamental shrubbery. What makes the inception of such nurseries as Mr. Hardy's a matter of congratulation is that they furnish to purchasers things that should have been proved suited to the climate and soil of Florida. Peach trees, roses, and grapes, sent from the north, bring here the habit of their northern growth, which often makes them worthless. With a singular stubbornness, they adhere to the times and seasons to which they have been accustomed farther north. We set a peach orchard of some 400 trees, which we obtained from a nursery in Georgia. We suspect now that, having a press of orders, our nurseryman simply sent us a packet of trees from some northern nursery. The consequence is that year after year, when all nature about them is bursting into leaf and blossom, when peaches of good size gem the boughs of Florida trees, our peach orchard stands sullen and leafless, nor will it start bud or blossom till the time for peaches to start in New York. The same has been our trouble with some fine varieties of roses which we took from our northern grounds. As yet they are hardly worth the ground they occupy, and whether they ever will do anything is a matter of doubt. Meanwhile, we have only to ride a little way into the pine woods to see around many a rustic cabin a perfect blaze of crimson roses and cluster roses, foaming over the fences in cascades of flowers. These are Florida roses, born and bred, and this is the way they do with not one tithe of the work and care that we have expended on our poor northern exiles. Mr. Hardy, therefore, in attempting the pioneer nursery of Florida, is doing a good thing for every newcomer, and we wish him all success. As a parting present, we received a fine summer squash, which, for the 1st of May, one must admit is good growth. And now, for the benefit of those who may want to take up land in Florida, we shall give the experience of some friends and neighbors of ours who have carried through about as thorough and well conducted an experiment as any, and we give it from memoranda which they have kindly furnished, in the hope of being of use to other settlers. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Palmetto Leaves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. Palmetto Leaves by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 14. Our Experience in Crops. A few years ago, 3 brothers, farmers from Vermont, exhausted by the long, hard winters there, came to Florida to try an experiment. They bought 275 acres in the vicinity of Mandarin at $1 per acre. It was pine land that had been cut over twice for timber, and was now considered of no further value by its possessor, who threw it into the hands of a land agent to make what he could of it. It was the very cheapest kind of Florida land. Of this land they cleared only 30 acres. The fencing cost $200. They put up a large, unplastered 2-story house with piazzas to both floors, at a cost of about $1,000. The additional outlay was on 2 mules and a pair of oxen, estimated at $400. The last year they put up a sugar mill and establishment at a cost of $500. An orange grove, a vineyard, and a peach orchard are all included in the program of these operators, and are all well under way. But these are later results. It is not safe to calculate on an orange grove under 10 years, or on a vineyard or peach orchard under 4 or 5. We have permission to copy verbatim certain memoranda of results with which they have furnished us. Cabbages. First year. Sowed seed in light sandy soil without manure. Weak plants, beaten down by rain, lost. Second year. Put out 1.5 acres of fine plants. Large part turned out poorly. Part of the land was low, sour, and wet, and all meagerly fertilized. Crop sold in Jacksonville for $250. Third year. 3 acres better, but still inadequately manured, and half ruined by the Christmas frost. Brought about $800. Fourth year. 1871-72. 2 acres better manured, planted in low land, on ridges 5 feet apart. Returned $600. In favorable seasons, with good culture, an acre of cabbages should yield a gross return of $500, of which $300 would be clear profit. Cucumbers. First year. Planted 4 acres, mostly new, hard, sour land, broadcasting 50 bushels of lime to the acre, and using some weak, half-rotted compost in the hills. Wretched crop. The whole lot sent north. Did not pay for shipment. Second year. 1.5 acres best land, heavily manured with well-rotted compost, worked into drills 8 feet apart. Yielded 50 bushels, which brought $250 in New York. More would have been realized, except that an untimely hailstorm spoiled the vines prematurely. Third year. 1.5 acres, well cultivated and manured, yielded 400 bushels, and brought a gross return of $1,300. Tomatoes. First year. Lost many plants through rain and wet and insufficient manure. Those we got to the New York market brought from $4 to $6 per bushel. Second year, manured too heavily in the hill with powerful unfermented manures. A heavy rain helped ruin the crop. Those, however, which we sent to market brought good prices. Third year, none planted for market, but those for family use did so well as to put us in good humor with the crop and induce us to plant for this year. Sweet potatoes. Every year we have had pretty good success with them on land well prepared with lime and ashes. We have had 350 bushels to the acre. Sugar cane has done very respectably on 1-year-old soil manured with ashes only, while mellow land, well prepared with muck, ashes, and fish guano, has yielded about 20 barrels of sugar to the acre. Irish potatoes. We have found these on light soil with only moderate fertilizing, an unprofitable crop at $4, but on good land with very heavy manuring, decidedly profitable at $2 per bushel. Fine potatoes rarely are less than that in Jacksonville. They will be ready to dig in April and May. Peas may be extraordinarily profitable and may fail entirely. A mild winter without severe frosts would bring them early into market. The Christmas freeze of 1870 caught a half-acre of our peas in blossom and killed them to the ground. Planted in the latter part of January, both peas and potatoes are pretty sure. We have not done much with peas, but a neighbor of ours prefers them to cabbages. He gets about $3 per bushel. As a general summary, our friend adds, for 2 years in succession we have found our leading market crops handsomely remunerative. The net returns look well compared with those of successful gardening near New York. Cabbages raised here during the fall and winter, without any protection, bear as good a price as do the spring cabbages which are raised in cold frames at the North, and early cucumbers, grown in the open air, have been worth as much to us as to Northern gardeners who have grown them in hotbeds. The secret of our success is an open one, but we ourselves do not yet come up to our mark, and reduce our preaching to practice. We have hardly made a good beginning in high manuring. We did not understand at first, as we now do, the difference between ordinary crops and early vegetables and fruit. Good corn may be raised on poor land at the rate of 5 or 10 bushels to the acre, but on 100 acres of scantily fertilized land, scarcely a single handsome cabbage can be grown. So with cucumbers, they will neither be early nor fit for market if raised on ordinary land with ordinary culture. Most of the market gardening in Florida, so far as we know it, cannot but prove disastrous. Land agents and visionaries hold forth that great crops may be expected from insignificant outlays, and so they decoy the credulous to their ruin. To undertake raising vegetables in Florida with these ideas of low culture is to embark in a leaky and surely sinking ship. If one is unwilling to expend for manure alone upon a single acre in 1 year enough to buy 100 acres of new land, let him give a wide berth to market gardening. Such expenditures have to be met at the North, and there is no getting round it at the South. Yet one can economize here as one cannot at the North. The whole culture of an early vegetable garden can go on in connection with the later crop of sugar cane. Before our cabbages were off the ground this spring, we had our cane rows between them, and we never before prepared the ground and planted the cane so easily. On another field we have the cane rows 8 feet apart, and tomatoes and snap beans intervening. We have suffered much for lack of proper drainage. We have actually lost enough from water standing upon crops to have underdrained the whole enclosure. We undertook to till more acres than we could do justice to. In farming, the love of acres is the root of all evil. So much for our friend's experiences. We consider this experiment a most valuable one for all who contemplate buying land and settling in Florida. It is an experiment in which untiring industry, patience, and economy have been brought into exercise. It has been tried on the very cheapest land in Florida, and its results are most instructive. Market gardening must be the immediate source of support, and therefore this experiment is exactly in point. This will show that the land is the least of the expense in starting a farm, and that it is best in the first instance to spend little for land and much for the culture of it. Thousands of people pour down into Florida to winter and must be fed. The Jacksonville market and the markets of all the different boarding establishments on the river need ample supplies, and there is no fear that there will not be a ready sale for all that could be raised. Our friends are willing to make a free contribution of their own failures and mistakes for the good of those who come after. It shows that a new country must be studied and tried before success is attained. Newcomers, by settling in the vicinity of successful planners, may shorten the painful paths of experience. All which we commend to all those who have written to inquire about buying land in Florida. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Palmetto Leaves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. Palmetto Leaves by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 15. May in Florida. Mandarin, May 28, 1872. The month of May in Florida corresponds to July and August at the North. Strawberries, early peaches, blackberries, huckleberries, blueberries, and 2 species of wild plums are the fruits of this month, and make us forget to want the departing oranges. Still, however, some of these cling to the bough, and it is astonishing how juicy and refreshing they still are. The blueberries are larger and sweeter, and less given to hard seeds, than any we have ever tasted. In the way of garden vegetables, summer squashes, string beans, and tomatoes are fully in season. This year, for the most part, the month has been most delightful weather. With all the pomp and glory of nature in full view, beholding in the wet lowlands red, succulent shoots, which under the moist, fiery breath of the season seem really to grow an inch at a time, and to shoot up as by magic, hearing bird songs filling the air from morning to night, we feel a sort of tropical exultation, as if great succulent shoots of passion or poetry might spring up within us from out this growing dream life. The birds, who can describe their jubilees, their exultations, their never-ending, still-beginning babble and jargon of sweet sounds? All day the air rings with sweet, fanciful trills and melodies, as if there were 1,000 little vibrating bells. They iterate and reiterate one sweet sound after another. They call to one another, and they answer from thicket to thicket. They pipe, they whistle, they chatter and mock at each other with airy defiance. And sometimes it seems as if the very air broke into rollicking bird laughter. A naturalist, who, like Thoreau, has sojourned for months in the Florida forests to study and observe nature, has told us that no true idea of the bird's plumage can be got till the hot months come on. Then the sun pours light and color, and makes feathers like steely armor. The birds love the sun, they adore him. Our own Phoebus, when his cage is hung on the shady side of the veranda, hangs sulky and silent, but put him in the full blaze of the sun, and while the thermometer is going up to the 90s, he rackets in a perfectly crazy abandon of bird babblement, singing all he ever heard before, and trying his bill at new notes, and, as a climax, ending each outburst with a purr of satisfaction like an overgrown cat. Several pairs of family mockingbirds have their nests somewhere in our orange trees, and there's no end of amusement in watching their dainty evolutions. Sometimes, for an hour at a time, one of them, perched high and dry on a topmost twig, where he gets the full blaze of the sun, will make the air ring with so many notes and noises that it would seem as if he were 40 birds instead of one. Then again you will see him stealing silently about, as if on some mysterious mission, perching here and there with a peculiar nervous jerk of his long tail, and a silent little lift of his wings, as if he were fanning himself. What this motion is for, we have never been able to determine. Our plantation at present is entirely given over to the domestic affairs of the mockingbirds, dozens of whom have built their nests in the green, inaccessible fastnesses of the orange trees, and been rearing families in security. Now, however, the young birds are to be taught to fly, and the air resounds with the bustle and chatter of the operation. Take, for example, one scene which is going on as we write. Down on the little wharf which passes through the swamp in front of our house, 3 or 4 juvenile mocking birds are running up and down like chickens, uttering plaintive cries of distress. On either side, perched on a tall, dry, last year's coffee bean stalk, sit papa and mamma, chattering, scolding, exhorting, and coaxing. The little ones run from side to side and say in plaintive squeaks, "I can't, I daren't," as plain as birds can say it. There, now they spread their little wings, and, oh joy, they find to their delight that they do not fall. They exult in the possession of a new-born sense of existence. As we look at this pantomime, graver thoughts come over us, and we think how poor, timid little souls moan and hang back and tremble when the time comes to leave this nest of earth, and trust themselves to the free air of the world they were made for. As the little bird's moans and cries end in delight and rapture in finding himself in a new, glorious, free life, so, just beyond the dark step of death, will come a buoyant, exulting sense of new existence. Our life here is in intimate communion with bird life. Their singing all day comes in bursts and snatches, and one awakes to a sort of wondering consciousness of the many airy dialects with which the blue heavens are filled. At night a whippoorwill or two, perched in the cypress trees, make a plaintive and familiar music. When the nights are hot and the moon bright, the mockingbirds burst into gushes of song at any hour. At midnight we have risen to listen to them. Birds are as plenty about us as chickens in a barnyard, and one wonders at their incessant activity and motion, and studies what their quaint little fanciful ways may mean, half inclined to say with Cowper, "But I, whatever powers were mine, would cheerfully those gifts resign, for such a pair of wings as thine, and such a head between 'em." Speaking of birds reminds us of a little pastoral which is being enacted in the neighborhood of St. Augustine. A young man from Massachusetts, driven to seek health in a milder climate, has bought a spot of land for a nursery garden in the neighborhood of St. Augustine. We visited his place, and found him and his mother in a neat little cottage, adorned only with grasses and flowers picked in the wild woods, and living in perfect familiarity with the birds, which they have learned to call in from the neighboring forests. It has become one of the fashionable amusements in the season for strangers to drive out to this cottage and see the birds fed. At a cry from the inmates of the cottage, the blue jays and mocking birds will come in flocks, settle on their shoulders, eat out of their hands, or out of the hands of any one who chooses to hold food to them. When we drove out, however, the birds were mostly dispersed about their domestic affairs, this being the nesting season. Moreover, the ample supply of fresh wild berries in the woods makes them less anxious for such dry food as contented them in winter. Only one pet mockingbird had established himself in a neighboring tree, and came at their call. Pick sat aloft, switching his long tail with a jerky air of indifference, like an enfant gâté. When raisins were thrown up, he caught them once or twice, but at last, with an evident bird yawn, declared that it was no go, and he didn't care for raisins. Ungrateful Pick! Next winter, eager and hungry, he will be grateful, and so with all the rest of them. One of the claims of May not to be forgotten is the blossoming of the great Cape jessamine that stands at the end of the veranda, which has certainly had as many as 300 or 400 great, white, fragrant flowers at once. As near as possible, this is the most perfect of flowers. It is as pure as the white camellia, with the added gift of exquisite perfume. It is a camellia with a soul. Its leaves are of most brilliant varnished green, its buds are lovely, and its expanded flower is of a thick waxen texture, and as large as a large camellia. We have sat moonlight nights at the end of the veranda, and enjoyed it. It wraps one in an atmosphere of perfume. Only one fault has this bush. It blossoms only once a season, not, like the ever-springing oleander, for months. One feels a sense of hurry to enjoy and appropriate a bloom so rare that lasts only a few weeks. Here in Florida, flowers form a large part of thought and conversation wherever one goes, and the reason of it is the transcendent beauty and variety that are here presented. We have just returned from St. Augustine, and seen some gardens where wealth and leisure have expended themselves on flowers, and in our next chapter we will tell of some of these beauties. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Palmetto Leaves. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. Palmetto Leaves by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 16. St. Augustine. Mandarin, May 30th, 1872. The thermometer with us during the third week in May rose to 92 in the shade, and as we had received an invitation from a friend to visit St. Augustine, which is the Newport of Florida, we thought it a good time to go seaward. So on a pleasant morning we embarked on the handsome boat Florence, which has taken so many up the river, and thus secured all the breeze that was to be had. The Florence is used expressly for a river pleasure boat, plying every day between Jacksonville and Palatka. It is long and airy and nicely furnished, and one could not imagine a more delightful conveyance. In hot weather one could not be more sure of cool breezes than when sailing up and down perpetually in the Florence. Our destiny, however, landed us in the very meridian of the day at Tekoi. Tekoi consists of a shed and a sandbank and a little shanty, where, to those who require, refreshments are served. On landing we found that we must pay for the pleasure and coolness of coming up river in the Florence by waiting 2 or 3 mortal hours till the starlight arrived, for the railroad car would not start till the full complement of passengers was secured. We had a good opportunity then of testing what the heat of a Florida sun might be, untempered by live oaks and orange shades, and unalleviated by ice water, and the lesson was an impressive one. The railroad across to St. Augustine is made of wooden rails, and the cars are drawn by horses. There was one handsome car like those used on the New York horse railroads. The others were the roughest things imaginable. Travelers have usually spoken of this road with execration for its slowness and roughness, but over this, such as it was, all the rank and fashion of our pleasure seekers the last winter have been pouring in unbroken daily streams. In the height of the season, when the cars were crowded, 4 hours were said to be consumed in performing this 15 miles. We, however, did it in about 2. To us this bit of ride through the Florida woods is such a never-ceasing source of interest and pleasure that we do not mind the slowness of it, and should regret being whisked by at steam speed. We have come over it 3 times, and each time the varieties of shrubs and flowers, grasses and curious leaves were a never-failing study and delight. Long reaches of green, moist land form perfect flower gardens, whose variety of bloom changes with every month. The woods hang full of beautiful climbing plants. The coral honeysuckle and the red begonia were in season now. Through glimpses and openings here and there we could see into forests of wild orange trees, and palmetto palms raised their scaly trunks and gigantic green fans. The passengers could not help admiring the flowers, and as there were many stops and pauses, and as the gait of the horses was never rapid, it was quite easy for the gentlemen to gather and bring in specimens of all the beauties, and the flowers formed the main staple of the conversation. They were so very bright and gay and varied that even the most unobserving could not but notice them. St. Augustine stands on a flat, sandy level, encompassed for miles and miles by what is called scrub, a mixture of low palmettos and bushes of various descriptions. Its history carries one back almost to the Middle Ages. For instance, Menendez, who figured as commandant in its early day, was afterwards appointed to command the Spanish Armada, away back in the times of Queen Elizabeth, but owing to the state of his health he did not accept the position. In the year 1586 Elizabeth then being at war with Spain, her admiral, Sir Francis Drake, bombarded St. Augustine and took it, helping himself, among other things, to 7 brass cannon, 2,000 pounds in money, and other booty. In 1605 it was taken and plundered by buccaneers. In 1702 besieged by the people of the Carolinas. In 1740 besieged again by General Oglethorpe of Georgia. So we see that this part of our country, at least, does not lie open to the imputation so often cast upon America, of having no historic associations, though, like a great deal of the world's history, it is written in letters of blood and fire. Whoever would know, let him read Parkman's Pioneers of France, under the article Huguenots in Florida, and he will see how the first Spanish governor, Menendez, thought he did God service when he butchered in cold blood hundreds of starving, shipwrecked Huguenots who threw themselves on his mercy, and to whom he had extended pledges of shelter and protection. A government officer whose ship is stationed in Matanzas Inlet told me that the tradition is that the place is still haunted by the unquiet ghosts of the dead. An old negro came to him, earnestly declaring that he had heard often at midnight shrieks and moans, and sounds as of expostulation, and earnest cries in some foreign language, at that place, and that several white people, whom he had taken to the spot, had heard the same. On inquiring of his men, Captain H. could find none who had heard the noises, although in digging in the sands, human bones were often disinterred. But surely, by all laws of demonology, here is where there ought to be the materials for a first-class ghost story. Here, where there has been such crime, cruelty, treachery, terror, fear, and agony, we might fancy mourning shades wandering in unrest, shades of the murderers, forever deploring their crime and cruelty. The aspect of St. Augustine is quaint and strange, in harmony with its romantic history. It has no pretensions to architectural richness or beauty, and yet it is impressive from its unlikeness to anything else in America. It is as if some little, old, dead and alive Spanish town, with its fort and gateway and Moorish bell towers, had broken loose, floated over here, and got stranded on a sandbank. Here you see the shovel hats and black gowns of priests, the convent, with gliding figures of nuns, and in the narrow, crooked streets meet dark-browed people with great Spanish eyes and coal-black hair. The current of life here has the indolent, dreamy stillness that characterizes life in old Spain. In Spain, when you ask a man to do anything, instead of answering as we do, in a minute, the invariable reply is in an hour, and the growth and progress of St. Augustine have been according. There it stands, alone, isolated, connected by no good roads or navigation with the busy living world. Before 1835, St. Augustine was a bower of orange trees. Almost every house looked forth from these encircling shades. The frost came and withered all, and in very few cases did it seem to come into the heads of the inhabitants to try again. The orange groves are now the exception, not the rule, and yet for 30 years it has been quite possible to have them. As the only seaport city of any size in Florida, St. Augustine has many attractions. Those who must choose a southern home, and who are so situated that they must remain through the whole summer in the home of their choice, could not do better than to choose St. Augustine. It is comparatively free from malarial fevers, and the sea air tempers the oppressive heats of summer, so that they are quite endurable. Sea bathing can be practiced in suitable bathing houses, but the sharks make open sea bathing dangerous. If one comes expecting a fine view of the open ocean, however, one will be disappointed, for Anastasia Island, a long, low sandbar, stretches its barren line across the whole view, giving only so much sea prospect as can be afforded by the arm of the sea, about 2 miles wide, which washes the town. Little as this may seem of the ocean, the town lies so flat and low that in stormy weather the waves used to be driven up into it, so as to threaten its destruction. A sea wall of solid granite masonry was deemed necessary to secure its safety, and has been erected by the United States government. This wall affords a favorite promenade to the inhabitants who there enjoy good footing and sea breezes. What much interested us in St. Augustine was to see the results of such wealth and care as are expended at the North on gardening being brought to bear upon gardens in this semi-tropical region. As yet, all that we have seen in Florida has been the beginning of industrial experiments, where utility has been the only thing consulted, and where there has been neither time nor money to seek the ornamental. Along the St. Johns you can see today hundreds of places torn from the forest, yet showing the unrotted stumps of the trees, the house standing in a glare of loose white sand in which one sinks over shoes at every step. If there be a flower garden, and wherever there is a woman there will be, its prospects in the loose sliding sands appear discouraging. Boards and brick edgings are necessary to make any kind of boundaries, and a man who has to cut down a forest, dig a well, build a house, plant an orange grove, and meanwhile raise enough garden stuff to pay his way, has small time for the graces. But here in St. Augustine are some families of wealth and leisure, driven to seek such a winter home, who amuse themselves during their stay in making that home charming, and the results are encouraging. In the first place, the slippery sand spirit has been caught and confined under green grass plats. The grass problem has been an earnest study with us ever since we came here. What grass will bear a steady blaze of the sun for 6 months with the thermometer at 130 or 40 is a question. It is perfectly easy, as we have proved by experiment, to raise flattering grass plats of white clover, and even of the red top, during the cool, charming months of January, February, and March. But their history will be summed up in the scriptural account, which today is and tomorrow is cast into the oven, as soon as May begins. The chances of an enduring sod for ornamental purposes are confined to 2 varieties, the broad and the narrow-leafed Bermuda grasses. These have roots that run either to the center of the earth or far enough in that direction for practical purposes, and are besides endowed with the faculty of throwing out roots at every joint, so that they spread rapidly. The broadleaf kind is what is principally employed in St. Augustine, and we have seen beautifully kept gardens where it is cut into borders, and where the grass plats and croquet grounds have been made of it to admirable advantage. A surface of green in this climate is doubly precious to the eye. We were visiting in a house which is a model for a hot climate. A wide, cool hall runs through the center, and wide verandas, both above and below, go around the whole 4 sides. From these we could look down at our leisure into the foliage of a row of Magnolia grandiflora, now in blossom. Ivy, honeysuckles, manrundia, and a host of other climbing plants make a bower of these outside corridors of the house. The calla lilies blossom almost daily in shaded spots, and beds of fragrant blue violets are never without flowers. Among the ornamental shrubbery we notice the chaparral, a thorny tree with clusters of yellow blossoms and long, drooping, peculiar leaves, resembling in effect the willow-leafed acacia. The banana has a value simply as an ornamental leaf plant, quite apart from the consideration of its fruit, which one can buy, perhaps better than one can raise, in this part of Florida. But it is glorious, when the thermometer is going up into the hundreds, to see the great, fresh, broad, cool leaves of the banana tree leaping into life, and seeming to joy in existence. In groups of different sizes they form most beautiful and effective shrubbery. The secret of gardening well here is to get things that love the sun. Plants that come originally from hot regions, and that rejoice the hotter it grows, are those to be sought for. The date palm has many beautiful specimens in the gardens of St. Augustine. A date palm at near view is as quaint and peculiar a specimen of nature as one can imagine. Its trunk seems built up of great scales, in which ferns and vines root themselves, and twine and ramble, and hang in festoons. Above, the leaves, 30 feet long, fall in a feathery arch, and in the center, like the waters of a fountain, shoot up bright, yellow, drooping branches that look like coral. These are the flower stalks. The fruit in this climate does not ripen so as to be good for anything. One gentleman showed me a young palm, now 6 feet high, which he had raised from a seed of the common shop date, planted 4 years ago. In this same garden he showed me enormous rose trees, which he had formed by budding the finest of the Bourbon ever-blooming roses in the native Florida rose. The growth in 3 years had been incredible, and these trees are an ever-springing fountain of fresh roses. There is a rose tree in St. Augustine in a little garden which all the sightseers go to see. It is a tree with a trunk about the size of an ordinary man's arm, and is said to have had 1,000 roses on it at a time. Half that number will answer our purpose, and we will set it down at that. Rose slugs and rose bugs are pests unheard of here. The rose grows as in its native home. One very pretty feature of the houses here struck me agreeably. There is oftentimes a sort of shaded walk under half the house, opening upon the garden. You go up a dusty street and stand at a door, which you expect will open into a hall. It opens, and a garden full of flowers and trees meets your view. The surprise is delightful. In one garden that we visited, we saw a century plant in bud. The stalk was 19 feet high, and the blossoms seemed to promise to be similar to those of the yucca. The leaves are like the aloe, only longer, and twisted, and contorted in a strange, weird fashion. On the whole, it looked as if it might have been one of the strange plants in Rappaccini's garden in Padua. The society in St. Augustine, though not extensive, is very delightful. We met and were introduced to some very cultivated, agreeable people. There is a fair prospect that the city will soon be united by railroad to Jacksonville, which will greatly add to the facility and convenience of living there. We recrossed the railroad at Tekoi on our way home, in company with a party of gentlemen who are investigating that road with the view of putting capital into it, and so getting it into active running order. One of them informed me that he was also going to Indian River to explore, in view of the projected plan to unite it with the St. John's by means of a canal. Very sensibly he remarked that in order to really make up one's mind about Florida, one should see it in summer, to which we heartily assented. By all these means this beautiful country is being laid open, and made accessible and inhabitable as a home and refuge for those who need it. On the steamboat coming back, we met the Florida Thoreau of whom we before spoke, a devoted, enthusiastic lover of nature as she reveals herself in the most secluded Everglades and forests. He supports himself and pays the expenses of his tours by selling the curiosities of nature which he obtains to the crowd of eager visitors who throng the hotels in winter. The feathers of the pink curlew, the heron, the crane, the teeth of alligators, the skins of deer, panther, and wildcat are among his trophies. He asserted with vehemence that there were varieties of birds in Florida unknown as yet to any collection of natural history. He excited us greatly by speaking of a pair of pet pink curlews which had been tamed, also of a snow-white stork with sky-blue epaulet on each shoulder, which is to be found in the Everglades. He was going to spend the whole summer alone in these regions, or only with Indian guides, and seemed cheerful and enthusiastic. He should find plenty of coconuts, and would never need to have a fever if he would eat daily of the wild oranges which abound. If one could only go in spirit and not in flesh, one would like to follow him into the Everglades. The tropical forests of Florida contain visions and wonders of growth and glory never yet revealed to the eye of the common traveler, and which he who sees must risk much to explore. Our best wishes go with our enthusiast. May he live to tell us what he sees. End of chapter 16.